It's my great pleasure to introduce my now very old friend, Matthias Kuntzel. Matthias Kuntzel has, in the last 21 years since 9/11, and even before that, become the most important liberal intellectual in Germany, discussing the connection between Islamism and anti-Semitism. Matthias taught at a technical college in Hamburg, and after 9/11 observed the trial of the Hamburg cell from which the attackers came. And as someone in the tradition of Aufarbeiten der Vergangenheit, the liberal tradition of facing the crimes of the Nazi past and their consequences, he wrote Jihad und Judenhass in 2002 or 3?
Published in 2002.
With Sa-Ira, a small left-wing press in Freiburg. Telos Press in the United States published Jihad and Jew Hatred, Islamism, Nazism, and the Roots of 9/11, and published in 2007, and I wrote the foreword. In 2012, this incredibly prolific essayist and author wrote Deutschland, Iran und die Bombe, Germany, Iran, and the Bomb in 2012. Earlier in the 1990s, Matthias, as a member of the Green Party, worked in the German Bundestag and became an expert on nuclear weapons and nuclear strategy. In 2019, he published Nazis und der Nahe Osten, wie der islamische Antisemitismus entstand, Nazis in the Middle East or Near East, how Islamic anti-Semitism originated. It is going to be published by Routledge in English as Aftershock, the Nazis, Islamism, Anti-Semitism in the Middle East, I believe in 2023. Matthias Kuntzel organized a website of his own. Much of it is in German, but it is also available in English. If you Google Matthias Kuntzel, Kuntzel, English, that website will come up. He has published approximately 100 articles since 2000, dealing with Nazism and Islamism, anti-Semitism, Iran's nuclear program. And in the course of doing so, he has done in Germany what Paul Berman and I and a few others in the United States have attempted to do, and that is to bring the discussion of these issues into the world of liberal intellectuals. Our success has been somewhat limited, but we have tried. And in recognition of his major accomplishments, both as a scholar and as an intellectual, a public intellectual, the Deutsch-Israelische Gesellschaft, the German-Israeli Society, whose president, Volker Beck, a former member of the Bundestag, is sitting here with us today. The German-Israeli Society awarded the Theodor Lessing Prize, named after a professor and opponent of Nazism, awarded the Theodor Lessing Prize to Dr. Kuntzel this June in Hanover. And I had the great privilege of being there and seeing the mayor of Hanover and many of the leading figures of Hanover public life give the award to Matthias after he gave a brilliant and splendid speech. The worthies of the city of Hanover and Lower Saxony gave him a standing ovation. He's going to speak for 25 or 28 minutes, or something like that. And it's really my great privilege to introduce him to you.
So let me start with the question, who am I to speak here? I'm a non-Jewish political scientist and historian from Hamburg. 30 years ago, I started to study Nazi ideology, especially anti-Semitic ideology, in order to understand how Auschwitz could happen and in order to understand how my own parents were able to love Hitler when they were young. Then came 9/11. This attack took place nearly exactly 21 years ago. Everyone who is old enough will be able to recall the horrifying images, the desperate faces behind the windows of the World Trade Center, the ordinary employees plunging into their death. The perpetrators forced hundreds of airplane passengers to take part in their own suicide in order to emulate thousands more at their workplaces. That was indeed a monstrous and outrageous crime. Norman Jarras, the British philosopher, called it a crime against humanity. So just as I had previously sought to understand the Nazi ideology, now I wanted to understand the ideology of the Islamists. I wanted to know what ideas propelled the group led by Mohammed Atta into action. I got an answer when the first trial of a member of Atta's group took place in Hamburg in 2002. I had the good fortune to know the Reuters journalist who attended and took notes at this trial. Let me quote what witnesses from the group told the court about Mohammed Atta. Quote, Atta's outlook was based on a National Socialist way of thinking. He considered New York to be the center of world Jewry, which was, in his opinion, enemy number one, end quote. The members of his group were convinced that the Jews had instigated the Second World War. They, quote, believed in a Jewish world conspiracy, end quote. Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, shared this outlook. Let me quote from his letter to the American people of November 2002. I quote, the Jews have taken control of your economy, through which they have taken control of your media, and now control all aspects of your life, making you their servants and achieving their aims at your expense, end quote. Here bin Laden constructs an opposition between evil Jews and good American people. His hatred of the USA is based on the conviction that the Jews control the country and abuse it for their own Jewish and Israeli ends. So we can see, although 9/11 was directed against the USA, the motivation for the action was anti-Semitic hatred. But most governments, mass media, and activists did not want to talk about the anti-Semitic dimension of 9/11. They showed no interest in the fantasy world of the perpetrators. They did not want to acknowledge the immanent logic behind their behavior, not even in the USA. The American official 9/11 Commission report of 2004 is a case in point. The word anti-Semitism does not appear in the report's section on bin Laden's worldview. In the framework of the war on terror, no specific provision was made for a struggle against the ideology that had motivated the terrorism in question. The weeks and months after 9/11 showed that this omission was a big mistake. Only 10 days after 9/11, Jeremy Corbyn and other veterans of Britain's radical left launched the Stop the War coalition, which would develop into an alliance between British Islamists and leftists. Palestinian suicide bombers were hailed as heroic freedom fighters. Extremist Muslim preachers used fiery sermons to encourage young British Muslims to aspire to jihad, not without success, as would became apparent in such events as the attack of 7th of July 2005 in London, the Manchester Arena bombing of 2017, or the killing of Lee Rigby. The refusal to recognize Al-Qaeda's true motives resulted in a reversal of responsibility. The more deadly the terrorism, so many believed, the greater the American or Israeli or British guilt. The perpetrators were declared the victims and the victims the perpetrators. Anti-Semitic conspiracy myths mushroomed. Graffiti associating the Star of David with the number 9/11 appeared in many places, also across Britain. The message was that Mossad had been involved in planning the attack. The slogan, "Hey USA, why did 4,000 Jews escape from boom?" referenced the claim that 4,000 Jews were allegedly worked in the World Trade Center did not turn up for work on 9/11 because they had been forewarned of the attack. This legend, invented and circulated by the Hezbollah television station Al-Manar, reached untold millions around the world with lightning speed. What picture of the Jews does such a story paint? First, it accepts the myth that Mossad will stop at nothing to damage the Arab case. Second, it suggests that 4,000 Jews in New York City would obey Mossad orders with military discipline. Third, it assumes the existence of a will to destroy the non-Jewish population, since according to this legend, New York Jews cold-bloodedly left their non-Jewish colleagues to die. The global spread of this hate virus marked a watershed in itself. Overnight, the fabrication of a Jewish world conspiracy had gained widespread currency as a basic interpretative framework for an event of global significance. And so, the attempt to ignore the Jew hatred of the 9/11 terrorists ended in disaster. This anti-Semitic attack became the starting point for the globalization of anti-Semitism. The big question then is, why was the anti-Semitic dimension of 9/11 ignored? How was this possible? One obvious answer, of course, is that at that time, the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism did not exist yet. But I would like now to take a closer look at this problem. What prevents people, generally speaking, from acknowledging anti-Semitism when it arises? Why do so many want to avoid this issue? I would like to offer you 3 ideas of mine on the subject. My first idea relates on the problem of rationalization. I have already mentioned the American official 9/11 Commission report that ignored Osama bin Laden's anti-Semitism. Instead, this document gives the wrong impression that Islamism originally arose in response to recent American and Western policies. This is the typical example of rationalization at work, unable to make sense of the real motivation behind 9/11. The report's bewildered authors found shelter in an idea that was familiar to them. The West is guilty. If the West had behaved differently, so goes this argument, then the attack would not have happened. But anti-Semitism rejects this logic. This is not an easy thing to grasp, since we live in a world in which we automatically believe that there must be a plausible source for every problem. But this is not how anti-Semitism operates. Anti-Semitism disregards the common sense logic of cause and effect. Think of the Shoah. We must constantly reiterate that there was not the slightest social or other plausible reason for the murder of 6 million Jews. The Nazis believed in their own delusion that the Jews were responsible for all the suffering and misery in the world. They were convinced that only the Jews' total construction could save the world from this suffering and misery. Their action was psychopathological. It was utterly divorced from reality. To this day, the Shoah provides us with the most convincing evidence for this special feature of anti-Semitism. There was and is no rational reason for it. And that is why it is so very wrong to separate the Holocaust from anti-Semitism and force it into the straitjacket of the post-colonialist ideology as a so-called intra-European colonial crime. This brings me to the first of my 3 suggestions for the London Centre. Holocaust awareness is central to the struggle against anti-Semitism. It is about remembering the murdered, but it is also and especially about our view of society and the world, about a view that does not avert its eyes from evil, but recognizes and fights it as a fact. Anyone who does not recognize the specific horror of the Holocaust will also not be able to recognize what distinguishes anti-Semitism from racism. And whoever does not recognize this specific feature of anti-Semitism will hardly be able to develop the sensitivity to the necessity for Israel to exist as a means of self-defense for the Jews. Back to our question. What prevents people from acknowledging anti-Semitism when it arises? Sparing Muslims is my second answer. Let us suppose that American Nazis had carried out a similar attack on the World Trade Center. Would governments and media have displayed the same lack of interest in the attackers' anti-Semitism? You will, I think, agree with me that this is inconceivable. So why is anti-Semitic behavior, when engaged in by Muslims, judged differently to that of Nazis? It is commonly said that the contemporary Jew hatred in the Middle East has nothing to do with the historic Jew hatred found in Europe. Some regard Muslim anti-Semitism as a slightly distorted form of liberation struggle by the Arabs. Others excuse it as a response to the activities of the Jewish state. All agree that Israeli Jews are responsible for the anti-Semites' behavior. Israel is the cause, so goes their mantra, and Jew hatred the effect. Any fact, however, that might contradict this rationalizing approach is ignored. Israel's alleged guilt must not be called into question. Thus, for example, many in the academic milieu don't want to know anything about the influence of Nazi Germany on the Arab world and its after effects. However, in this area, numerous new studies, many from my friend Jeffrey Herf, have appeared since 9/11 that demonstrate that contemporary Jew hatred in the Middle East is intimately linked to the historic Jew hatred of Europe, that Nazi Germany's anti-Semitic propaganda in the Arab language left enduring legacies in the Middle East, that the striking similarity between contemporary anti-Jewish slogans and graphics and those of the Nazis is no accident. Too many, however, refuse to take the Islamists' Jew hatred seriously and confront the plain meaning of what they say and write. This leads to a further peculiarity. Many of those who downplay anti-Semitism are finding excuses in the Middle East for what they condemn in Europe. I quote, "Are all forms of Holocaust denial the same?" asks anti-Zionist Professor Gilbert Ashkar. For example, quote, "Should such Holocaust denial, when it comes from oppressors, not be distinguished from the denial in the mouths of the oppressed?" End quote. Here, Ashkar gives the Holocaust deniers, as long as they belong to what he considers an oppressed group, a moral carte blanche. What would otherwise be outrageous becomes acceptable. It borders, in my opinion, on racism to construct a kind of homo Islamicus by applying different standards to Muslims than to non-Muslims. Muslims are thus infantilized, enrolled as members of a group in need of protection. They are denied the will and critical capacity that we as Europeans claim for ourselves. It is my fellow Muslims, writes Majid Nawaz, who suffer most from this patronizing, self-pity inspiring mollycoddling, end quote. It goes without saying that those who fight anti-Semitism must also fight every form of racism, also when it is displayed by Jews in Israel or elsewhere. However, we must at the same time insist that people who claim to be fighting racism must also fight all forms of anti-Semitism, even when it is displayed by Muslims. Here, however, we come up against a major and acute problem that I will illustrate through a short digression. All relevant surveys worldwide and in Western Europe show that anti-Semitic attitudes are far more prevalent among Muslims than among non-Muslims. In Germany, for example, a representative survey in May 2022 revealed that anti-Semitism was far more widespread among Muslims than among the general population, and was especially strong among those Muslims who frequently attend mosques, while an embarrassing 23% of the general German population agreed with the proposition that Jews are too powerful. The figure rose to 49% for Muslims and to 68% among strongly religious Muslims, so 23 to 49 to 68. Moreover, the Islamist anti-Semitism is marked by an exceptional radicalism. Let us take just one example, the example of the Holocaust. Old-style neo-Nazi groups in Europe tend to deny or minimize the Holocaust. They rarely openly justify it. But Sayyid Qutb, the most famous member of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 20th century, justified the Shoah and described it as a divine and just punishment. I quote, "Then Allah brought Hitler to rule over them," end quote. This may be an extreme example, but such statements arouse no significant criticism or condemnation in the Arab public discourse. Moreover, they are not confined to marginal groups. Thus, in 2009, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, today's leading ideologue of the Muslim Brotherhood, repeated Qutb's approach. His justification of the Holocaust was aired on Al Jazeera television. I quote, "Throughout history, Allah has imposed upon the Jews people who would punish them for their corruption. The last punishment was carried out by Hitler. He managed to put them in their place. This was divine punishment for them. Allah willing, the next time will be at the hands of the believers," end quote. What Qaradawi hopes for is clear. The next divine punishment, such as the Holocaust, will be perpetrated by Muslims. With this, we have arrived at the current scenario, keyword Tehran. This renewed punishment of the Israeli Jews, allegedly justified on religious grounds, is what the Islamists in Tehran are preparing and propagating. Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei has described, quote, "the war on Palestine as a war on the existence of Islam," end quote. His conclusion is clear. We believe that the annihilation of the Israeli regime is a solution to the issue of Palestine, end quote. There is, of course, no rational basis for Tehran's hatred of Israel. There are no border issues between Israel and Iran, nor is there any refugee issue between them. Nonetheless, the Iranian regime asserts that Israel and Zionism represents an evil that must be eradicated in order to liberate humanity. In this respect, what the Tehran regime is preparing in plain sight goes beyond 9/11. The Revolutionary Guards boast that they, quote, "will raise the Zionist regime in less than 8 minutes." An Iranian television documentary, 7 Minutes to Tel Aviv, shows footage of simulated attacks against key targets in Israel, including the Dimona nuclear reactor, the Knesset, and business hubs. Iran's supreme guide, Ali Khamenei, has stated that by 2040 at the latest, Israel will no longer exist. A countdown clock in Tehran shows the number of days to go before Israel's appointed end is supposed to come. Western governments, however, do not take this genocidal anti-Semitism seriously. Why? Presumably because they are yet again in the grip of the cause and effect delusion and rationalize Tehran's Jew hatred by believing that Israel must in some way be responsible for it. Analyzing and combating these Iranian plans has nothing to do with Islamophobia, but everything to do with Theodor Adorno's categorical imperative that we must do all in our power to ensure, quote, that Auschwitz is never repeated, that nothing like it ever happens again, end quote. Many modern academics, however, avoid this issue out of fear of being labeled anti-Arab or Islamophobic. This is a serious problem. Many in Western universities fearing ostracism do not say what they think and restrict the scope of their research. Hopefully, the London Centre can make a difference here. In Britain itself, there are prominent Muslims who fight actively against anti-Semitism amongst Muslims, I hope. And this is my second proposal, that the LCSCA will support them and also encourage non-Muslim researchers to address the topic of anti-Semitism among Muslims with an unflinching gaze. So back to our initial question, what prevents people from acknowledging anti-Semitism when it occurs? This brings me on to a final, quite short point related to Jeremy Corbyn and his Islamist leftist alliance. The issue here is Israel-directed anti-Semitism. Hostilities against Israel appear today in the form of a pincer movement. On one side of the pincer, we have classic anti-Semites such as Ali Khamenei or Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. On the other side, we find non-Jewish and Jewish fellow travelers of anti-Semitism, the so-called anti-Zionists, who take up and further Iran's attempts to make the destruction of the Jewish state ideologically and emotionally more acceptable. An essential feature of such anti-Zionism is a forgery of the Middle East's factual history. They cling, for example, to the PLO mantra that, I quote, Zionism is organically linked with the world imperialism and is opposed to all liberation movements or movements for progress in the world, to quote the PLO Charter of 1968. This is a falsification of history. In fact, the opposite is true, as Jeffrey Herf has recently, hey, Jeffrey. Okay. As Jeffrey Herf has recently shown in his latest, I would say, must-read book entitled Israel's Moment. On the one hand, we learn that before 1948, Zionism was not promoted but combated by world imperialism, if we mean by that the British government and the Pentagon and State Department in the USA, because at the start of the Cold War, Zionism was considered a tool of Moscow. On the other hand, in 1946, Zionism was not opposed but supported by the movements for progress in the world referred to by the PLO. This included not only all the Soviet bloc governments, but also all those leftist, liberal, and conservative forces in the USA that had adopted an anti-Nazi position during the war. In the face of the Shoah in 1945, all these forces advocated the establishment of a Jewish state. Moreover, in 1948, when the Arab countries attacked Israel, they came out in defense of this state while also denouncing anti-Semites and Nazi collaborators such as the former Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini. I'm therefore convinced, and this is my third and last proposal, that the London Centre must strive to break the PLO's historiographical monopoly and develop a new and independent view of Middle Eastern history. In 1975, the United Nations General Assembly voted to target Zionism as a form of racism. Although this resolution was overturned in 1991, hatred of Israel has remained virulent, especially in universities. It is high time to dispel the miasma that had distorted the study of Middle Eastern history since then. There is still much to discover, and we will perhaps find out that the new London Centre can reconnect with the tradition of the anti-Nazi movement of the late 1940s. So those are my three suggestions for the Centre's work. Firstly, to reinforce Holocaust awareness in order to highlight the specific nature of anti-Semitism. Secondly, to analyze anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. And thirdly, to reconstruct the real history of the Middle East conflict, free from ideological blinkers. And let me add, for one really horrifying moment, there was a prospect of an anti-Semitic British Prime Minister, but the worst did not happen. This was also due to the British Jewish community's unity and strong will to resist. However, the whole episode also shows how thin is the ice on which we are skating and how much work lies ahead of us. The false conclusions drawn from 9/11 should be a reminder of the peril. I really appreciate your attention, and I would like to thank my London friend Colin Mead for his help in preparing this paper. May the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism enjoy the great success that is needed. Thank you.